Hello and welcome everyone to Tetrate Tech Talks. My name is Eitan Suez. Happy Friday. Today is Friday, April 8th. Tetrate Tech Talks is a weekly live stream where we feature a conversation with a guest to discuss technology, of course, and where we do technical demonstrations and discuss upcoming events and announcements and much, much more. If you just join us, feel free to come in and say hello. Oh, wonderful. I see. Hello from Greece. Oh, that's exciting. I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas. So the time here is 11 o'clock in the morning. I suspect it's evening in Greece right now. And the Bay Area, it's 9 a.m. Pacific. So if you're in the Bay Area, good morning. If you're in Europe, I would say, I guess, good evening. And thank you for joining us. If you were here last week, you know that last week was our inaugural episode 1, where we featured our CEO, made a brief cameo appearance to welcome everybody. And then we had a colleague of mine, Tetrate, Bart Van Bos, joined us from Belgium and talked about service mesh in the enterprise. That was a fun interview. So welcome to episode 2. And I'd like to share with you, I guess, first and foremost, our sort of landing page for Tetrate Tech Talks. Let me see if I can zoom in real quick on the sort of nav bar and the URL up there, so you can actually see the URL, tetratelabs.github.io. I'll share with you that URL a little bit later in the show, and maybe we'll post it also in the chat. But yeah, so Tetrate's the enterprise service mesh company. Much of our focus is on service meshes. That is Istio, Envoy, Kubernetes, and much more. But in this and upcoming episodes, we won't shy away from tackling even the broader topics. I'm working on an upcoming episode with a guest where we'll sort of deviate a little bit from our sort of main theme. We are streaming live to both LinkedIn Live and YouTube, and you can also find our YouTube playlist. The link is on our landing page. So let's talk about our episodes. This is a weekly episode. Today, Friday, April 8th, is episode 2, beautiful spring morning here in Texas, where we're going to discuss the subject of upgrading Istio. But before we get started, there's a whole slew of announcements and upcoming things that I want to put on your radar. So bear with me as we sort of go through that sort of list of things to discuss. I think there's a lot of exciting things coming up real soon. I want to begin by talking about some of the things I've been busy doing, which is lining up speakers for upcoming episodes. And I'm happy to announce that I reached out to a fellow by the name of Lucas Ponce, who is a committer with the Kiali project. Kiali is the sort of console for Istio. And if you haven't checked out Kiali is kind of a fun, really a fun project to explore. And I'm going to just pop it up here for you on the screen. Why not? So kiali.io, the console for Istio Service Mesh. Check it out. So we're going to have Lucas on April 22nd, hopefully, for episode 4, and he's going to demo a Kiali for us. We'll explore that product together. The following week is the week of IstioCon, the annual conference on all things Istio. Let me pop up here. You can see that the program for IstioCon has been sort of announced. That took place, I think, maybe about a week ago. And we've got sessions going on all week from Monday through Friday. There's going to be a keynote talk by Eric Brewer, which I definitely look forward to. Eric Brewer is, I guess, known for the CAP theorem and much more. But on Friday, April 29th, we still have IstioCon going on. Oh, wonderful. We see here Ronak says hello from India. Welcome, Ronak. Thanks for joining us. So we're going to be busy on the 29th watching IstioCon talks. So that week is going to be a bye week for us. And then we'll pick up the following week on May 6th, where I'm really excited to let you know that I reached out to an old friend of mine who's the author of the recently published book by O'Reilly titled WebAssembly, The Definitive Guide. I have it here with me. Let me see if I can sort of share it with you here on camera. So here it is, WebAssembly, the Definitive Guide by Brian Sletton. And Brian is an old friend, an old acquaintance from conference circuit. We met years and years ago, and he's agreed to come on May 6th and discuss WebAssembly with us. So that's another exciting topic that we're going to broach in an upcoming episode. All right, so let's sort of zero in on what we're going to do today. We're going to discuss canary upgrading Istio, and I have a lot to say about it. I'm going to be doing the demo, and unfortunately was not able to line up in short notice a guest. So we won't have a guest for this episode, but that's going to be more the exception than the rule. But we're building up a really good queue of upcoming speakers. So let's mosey on. And by the way, all of the information I'm showing you here is on our landing page, which is a public GitHub repository. It's published to GitHub pages. You can click on this little GitHub link there, and you can actually see everything. You can clone, you can open up issues. So it's completely transparent. If you want to know even ahead of time what we're going to talk about, it's all going to be published there. I sort of like this view here. I'm going to make myself a little smaller so you can see and follow along. All right, so we're going to talk about upgrading Istio. Here is my outline of things I want to discuss before we get into the demo proper. So if you're new to Tetrate Talks, we welcome you. We want you to join us each Friday. We're going to be running another episode. And the objective is essentially learning and sharing knowledge is the primary objective, but above all, having fun doing so. And it wouldn't be fun if we didn't also get a little more social about it and get to know folks in the service mesh community. So we definitely will be bringing on a lot of people onto this show. And so I hope you will be able to join us in future episodes for some exciting interviews. I'm lining up something special for next week. It's not yet posted on our schedule, but hopefully he'll confirm and it'll come through. And that's something I'm really excited to talk about. So I've already mentioned we've already sort of got a commitment to talk about Kiali and WebAssembly. I'm your host, Eitan Suez. I love to talk tech. I sort of started out in sort of the dev sphere, but these days we're all doing a bit of dev, a bit of ops, a bit of sec. So that's sort of the nature of things. I love to talk tech, and I'll be talking service mesh with you today. So let me begin by talking about an interesting sort of follow-up link from our conversation from last week. So last week we talked about onboarding VMs onto the service mesh, and I was just chatting the other day with my colleague Peter, who and I'm going to pop up this link so you can see it in just a minute. Let's see. Here we go. So this is a blog entry that Peter shared with me. He said, "Hey, by the way, if you we talked about onboarding VMs. And there's a blog about onboarding VMs that you should check out." And this was actually a very exciting, very interesting read, though it leaves you with a bit of a cliffhanger at the end. That they talk about different ways, different use cases for onboarding VMs onto the mesh. And one use case is rather interesting. It's this whole idea of local development, where your local VM can be part of the mesh for the sake of connecting to other microservices. So they're very interesting ideas, but the actual recipe is yet to be announced. I suspect part 2 will be published before long, and then we'll have the full picture on that. Let's carry on. So I wanted to remind you that Tetrate runs a number of free workshops. Those workshops are published publicly on our Tetrate Labs GitHub organization. And we also run sort of an instructor-led version of these workshops roughly once a month. So the next one that's coming up is coming up April 20th, where my colleague Peter will talk about WebAssembly with Envoy and Istio. It's wonderful to see. Thank you guys for coming on and saying hello. I see Juan Esteban is saying hi, and from Colombia. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, so these workshops are free. You can work through them on your own in a self-paced fashion, or you can join one of our upcoming workshops by registering on our website. Those basically, if you visit the Tetrate website, there's an events page on the Tetrate website that will show you what upcoming events are, and you can register for them. I also would like to mention that Tetrate has a certified Istio administrator exam available, which is very much in the same spirit as the Kubernetes certifications. So if you've taken the CKA or the CCAD or the CKS, you know what I'm talking about. And as I personally explore service meshes, I've almost become convinced that the picture isn't complete. If you've adopted Kubernetes, you need to look at service mesh to really get sort of a complete package, and so that sort of carries over to certifications as well. Now, this is the exam does have a cost, a fee, but I'm happy to also mention that we have a free on our Academy webpage. We have a free course called Istio Fundamentals. So let me walk you through this. So this is our landing page for our administrator certification for Istio. And if you navigate to our courses, we also have a course called Istio Fundamentals, which is entirely free. And if you take and complete this course, you also get a 50% off coupon for the exam. So that's, I think, in my opinion, a pretty good deal. So if you want to really get serious with service mesh and go all the way to getting your certification, you can do it through that route. Take the free course, get your 50% off coupon, and then register for taking the certification exam. And you have 12 months in which to prepare and take the exam. Okay, let's carry on to industry events that are coming up. So IstioCon is almost upon us, about 2 weeks away, I'd say, April 23rd to 29th. I've already mentioned it. This is an online conference. And I'm happy to mention that I will be conducting a workshop for IstioCon. So if you want to look at IstioCon 2022 and look at the workshops, it's all out there, and as well as the program. So there are sessions and there are workshops. Each of the different days, the 25th, 26th, and 28th, we have 3 different workshops, which I think create sort of a journey. So you can start at the very beginning with Istio 0 to 60. This is the workshop that I'm going to be giving together with my colleague Peter, and then there are other workshops later on in the week. So that's exciting. That's coming up. Next, we have Service MeshCon and KubeCon EU happening in May, in mid-May, May 16th through 20th, and we can go and look at those. So there's the landing page for Service MeshCon and KubeCon. And the thing that I want to relate to everyone here that's with us, as Tetrate has decided to sort of go all in and be there and be present, and also run its own free 1-day immersion day, is what we call it, Service Mesh Immersion Day. That's happening on May the 16th. It's a completely free event, and this is happening in Spain. This is an in-person event, which is in my opinion, really refreshing to see after the last couple of years that we've sort of had to deal with doing everything online. So that's going to be in Valencia, Spain. Okay, so yet another thing that we're sort of kicking off is this idea of roadshows. Okay, so let me sort of switch to the web view of our presentation here. So roadshows, Tetrate roadshows. What are these about? They're basically a sort of like sort of an afternoon event, 3 to 4 hour event. We're doing one in Seattle next week, April 14th, where our founders, Varun and JJ, are going to be in Seattle doing a roadshow. So if you're in the Seattle area, this is an in-person event at, I think, the Four Seasons Hotel. You can register for that and come and see what our founders have to say. And then we also follow that up the following week. Now, this is a little bit small. Let me make that bigger. Here we go. On April 21st in Austin, we also are doing an Austin Roadshow, and our head of product, Zach Butcher, is going to be there. Our head of customer success, Dave Borsch, is going to be there. And I'm going to be doing a presentation, a free workshop. So definitely join us if you want to register. If you happen to be in the Texas area, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, join us for that event. And then there's also an online event that my colleague Peter is doing for the Eastern Canada CNCF meetup. So that's a wonderful talk that Peter is putting together on everything to do with Istio gateways. If you want to really get a good understanding of Istio gateways in sort of a nice, sort of 20 to 30 minute time slice, then this is one that you might want to attend. So lots and lots of events happening. And by the way, you don't have to remember any of this. This page is live. It's online. You can just go visit the Tetrate TED Talks landing page. And it's all the links are there for you to explore. All right, and finally, before we get started with our episode, with the meat or the main course of our session today, I want to highlight the fact that we have a community Slack channel. I know some of you are already on there. It's called tetrate-community.slack.com. It's free, it's open, and I cannot stress enough the fact that this gives you a direct line of communication between with everyone at Tetrate. We've got Tetrate engineers who are signed onto the Slack. You can ask questions about our certification exam. You can ask questions about our tech talks. You can suggest an event. If you have a topic for an upcoming event, if you want to ask questions about our workshops, it's all there. So definitely take advantage of that resource. And we want to hear from you. All right, so we're finally there. We're done with announcements and what's happening in the community. And I want to sort of segue from that to discussing our demo. All right, so let's get started with our demo. And I'd like to begin with talking about sort of the commonality of the theme that's sort of maybe accidentally building up here. Tetrate is a service mesh company. And it's exploring service mesh, I think, to me was a very interesting journey. But there's a separate concern, something you typically call day two operations. I don't know if you've heard of that term, day two operations, which I think really captures the spirit of a very important point, which is that typically a lot of the effort and the sweat is actually operationalizing something, and the recurring costs, so to speak, administering, maintaining, monitoring, keeping things running. And so last week we talked about a very important point, which is a service mesh, more often than not in the enterprise, is going to have to be inclusive. That is, it doesn't just, it's not exclusive of workloads running in a Kubernetes cluster, but should rather also include other workloads running on VMs. And so in the same vein and in the same spirit, another very important facet of operationalizing service mesh is this whole notion of zero downtime upgrades of the platform itself, right? If you're onboarding all these workloads onto the platform, what happens when the platform itself needs to be swapped from underneath you, so to speak? It's like, imagine people standing in the room and there's a rug, and you need to sort of replace the rug without disturbing anything in the room, so to speak. So that's what we're going to be talking about, and that's very exciting. And I always like to begin with sort of anchoring, where does this come from? So this is a topic that really comes from the Istio docs. So if we visit the Istio documentation, I'm going to make my font size a little bit smaller, and there is in the nav bar under setup a section called upgrade. And under upgrade, you have different topics. And the one we're going to be talking about is the one called canary upgrades. So this is the recipe that I'm going to walk you through. But I have a tendency to always like to specialize and customize the recipe to do our own sort of explorations, and maybe deviate from this recipe to whatever extent we like. And so we're going to explore this topic of upgrading Istio in a canary fashion. And all of that information is in the Istio documentation, but my custom recipe is here in front of you. And we're going to use the sort of canonical sample application that comes with the Istio release. It's called Bookinfo. There are a number of sample apps that come with Istio. Bookinfo is probably the most popular one. And before we jump all the way into the demo, there's another important thing that I want to bring up here. On the Istio website, there is a page that is easy to overlook. It's called Feature Status. And it looks like this. And this essentially is a snapshot in time. So the first table that's illustrated here is an explanation of the different markers for different features of service mesh and what their state is. I think the term that they use is phase, what phase they're in. So it could be a stable feature, a feature that's in beta, in alpha, or a feature that's experimental. And what the meaning of that is from a different perspectives, from the point of view of stability, purpose, performance, support, backwards compatibility, deprecation, versioning, and so on. And if you look through the various tables that are published here, what you will notice is these features that we're going to talk about today, which are, I think, towards the bottom, under core, there we go, are called revision-based upgrades and revision tags. And notice that they're in alpha. So that's my caveat before we get started, is we're talking about a feature that's in alpha, but I suspect they're probably towards the late end of alpha and are pretty close to becoming beta, which means that the stability will increase dramatically going forward. So wanted to mention that before we go any further. And I'm going to close a few of these tabs so that I just don't get confused by them. Too many tabs. All right. So what are we going to do? Right. In this exercise, we're going to, we need to set the stage. We're going to start with, obviously, we need a Kubernetes cluster and Istio installed on it. And it sort of makes sense if we're talking about upgrades to begin with sort of the prior version. So, you know, we talk about semantic versioning. The 1.12.5 is the prior minor version of Istio, and the latest is 1.13.2. And so what we're going to essentially do is set up a cluster with Istio, deploy some workload, book info, to our cluster, and then we're going to ask ourselves the questions: how do we upgrade Istio to version 1.13 without disturbing or disrupting these workloads? And what does it mean to actually upgrade Istio? There are a number of different concerns, right? We talk about data plane and control plane, and we need to take care of both. We need to upgrade the control plane as well as the data plane. That basically means the sidecars, the Envoy proxies that are sort of attached to each of our workloads. All right, and there's two parts to this. Part one is the foundational mechanism for doing these upgrades, which is tied to the notion of labeling namespaces. And then there's another part, which is called revision tags, which is sort of an improvement upon the basic mechanism, which we'll talk about second. All right, so that's what we're going to do. And in the instructions that follow, I'm going to be using GCP, but you feel free to follow along. You can actually do this on your own even after the episode. So maybe we do this as a group now, and then you can sort of do this on your own later. And feel free to use any Kubernetes you like, whether it's Minikube or Kind or something local, or whether it's something else like Amazon EKS or what have you. All right, so I'm going to be dropping down to my terminal in a minute, and maybe what I'll do is set this up in such a way that there we go. Okay, so these are my instructions. Set this up in such a way that we have a terminal that's maybe split screen with our instructions. That might work out really well. Maybe in some occasions when we look at tabular data, we'll sort of expand our view to make it easier to work with. So the first thing we need to do is create a cluster. And I'm really starting from scratch because I really want to show you there's no prior context here. Okay. All right, so we're firing off a command. This is a gcloud command to create a GKE cluster with 3 nodes. And while that's baking, it's a perfect segue to talk about our client setup. How do we set this up on the client? And so that's what we really need to talk about next. How do we install Istio normally, right? We typically download a release distribution and see right there. Okay. And the way we do it, and I can walk you through where we get this information from. When we go to the Istio docs, when we get started, we're sort of told, okay, this is how you install Istio. You basically do a curl command to download a release, right? And you can actually specify what version of a release you want and what your machine architecture is on your client. And that's to make sure that the release you're downloading has binaries that are compatible with your particular machine architecture. So I'm running on an ARM architecture with the MacBook. So I'm going to be running a command similar to this but it's going to vary depending on your platform, of course. So when we download this, we don't yet install Istio, we just download the bits. Okay, and so let me show you how I've got that set up. So I'm going to open another window here. Okay, and in my workspace, I'm going to do a directory listing to show you that I've got both Istio 112 and Istio 113 already downloaded. And when you navigate to these folders, okay, typically the Istio Cuddle CLI is going to be in the bin subfolder. You see it right there. And it's really material. It's really important to know which version of Istio Cuddle you're using, especially if you're in the context of doing an upgrade. You're upgrading from one version to another. You need to use the corresponding version of Istio Cuddle that matches the version you want to install. So if I use the Istio Cuddle for version 112 to install Istio, I'll be installing version 112 and vice versa. So how do I set things up and make it really convenient for myself? And this is where there's this nice little tool called Durenv, which I came across years ago watching a fellow by the name of Dr. Nick. I don't know if anyone knows who Dr. Nick is. He was a rather central figure in the Cloud Foundry community. He used to be the evangelist for a cloud-based infrastructure system called Bosch. And he introduced me to Durenv. And Durenv is essentially one of these Linux command line tools that do one thing and they do them well. And I've got Durenv installed on my machine. And the way Durenv works is very, very simple. The basic idea is this. It's the idea of configuring your environment and associating it with a particular directory that you navigate to. So the idea is you create a file called .envrc, and in this case, it's just a shell script that sets my path to include Istio Cuddle, the one that's in my bin subfolder, as in the front of my path, so that when I type Istio Cuddle version here, notice that my version is 112.5, and I've done the same thing for version 113. So if I just by navigating to version 113, I've updated my path, and now if I type Istio Cuddle version, 113. So this is rather convenient. I love Durenv for that reason. I've had more than one occasion where it was sort of the perfect tool for the job. It makes my life easier. I don't have to reconfigure my path when I want to sort of switch from one version of Istio to another. So that's sort of my tip for you guys, is use Durenv. That's what I'm going to be using. So notice that I'm now in my Istio 112 folder. And if you follow along with the instructions on the Istio documentation, the first thing you're told to do before you install Istio, well, other than checking and making sure that your Kubernetes cluster is ready, is to run a pre-check command. So it's actually an experimental command. If you look at that command, I'm not going to run it yet since my cluster is still sort of in the process of being provisioned. That X there in the middle of that command is the short name for experimental, which means that pre-check is still subject to change and to improvements, and hopefully that won't be long before maybe that label gets removed. But pre-check is essentially a simple way to run some validations to make sure you've got the right compatible version of Kubernetes that you're going to install Istio on. And a number of other checks that just basically let you know, by the way, it looks like your cluster is in good shape and you're ready to proceed with the installation. So that's a good thing to do. It looks like my cluster is now running, perfect timing. So if I just run my couple of diagnostic kubecuddle commands, here are my 3 worker nodes and my namespaces. I don't yet have Istio running. And so the first thing I need to do is install Istio. So let's run that pre-check command. And okay, so we're told there are no issues. It's safe to go ahead and proceed with installation. So let's do just that. All right, I'm sort of running headlong with my demo, and I'm not really paying too close attention to the comments, but I know that there's some folks, some colleagues who are watching my back. So again, if you have questions, just pop them in there and we'll answer them. So hopefully everybody is with me so far. We've done our pre-check command. We're ready to install Istio. And my main observation going through this exercise is that there are certain habits that I've built up by following sort of the getting started recipe of installing Istio. When we install Istio, there are a number of configuration flags. So the main one that sticks out in my mind is this idea of the Istio profile. There are a number of different profiles that you can use. There's a minimal profile, a default profile, a demo profile, and so on and so forth. And when we install Istio, we typically specify which profile we want. But here we see a new flag, right? We see a flag or a field called revision, and that's new. So the idea, this is called a revision-based installation. And the idea here is when you install Istio, you give it a label or a tag of sorts. It's not really a tag. It's just, a piece of metadata. Yeah, so, I mean, in the loose sense of the word, it is. And when we run Istio cuddle install, we pass in this revision. And that's going to do something a little bit different from what we've seen in the past. So notice we're prompted, hey, you're going to be installing version 112.5 with the default profile. Is that really what you wanted? And indeed, I did not make a mistake. Humans are so fallible, right? I oftentimes might use the wrong version of Istio cuddle, so it's important to pay attention to these prompts. So I'm going to say yes, and we're going to proceed and install Istio. And if you've done this before, you know that this doesn't take long, right? What are we doing? Installing all of the Istio CRDs, and there are other things besides, the Istio control plane, Istio D, which is the control plane, and then there's also an ingress gateway that gets installed as well. So the question is, and I'm really a big believer in always following up every command I run with a sanity test, validation, checking that we actually got this right. How do we know that we have Istio 112 installed, right? So that's the next question. So I like to look at my namespaces. Okay, so notice there's a new namespace there called Istio system. I could look at the pods in Istio system. And the thing that jumps out at me here, if you've done this before without using revisions, is that the name of the pod has changed, right? The name of the deployment, right? Kget deploy. If we look at the deployment in Istio system, is Istio 112.5. So that revision is used as a suffix, and you can understand why, right? Because if we're going to install, if we need to accommodate for multiple control planes, multiple versions to be running, we need to somehow be able to distinguish between them, and we need to sort of somehow namespace them, right? By using the suffix, we're making sure that one version doesn't step on the toes of another one and override it. And so you could actually see essentially the design of this. The design ideas manifesting themselves in the way things are named. We can also look at services in Istio system. And you'll notice there too that other than our ingress gateway, which has an external IP address tied to a load balancer in my infrastructure, we also have Istio-D's cluster IP service, which also has a name that's now unique that contains that revision number. All right, so far so good. There's another thing you want to pay attention to, which is this notion of mutating webhooks, which are installed by Istio. And notice that this sidecar injector, right, that piece of code that's in charge of making sure that Envoy sidecars get sort of embedded in your pods, also has a custom label, so to speak. Its name has 112.5 in it. So that's important to point out. All right, let's carry on. All right, so one of the commands that I'm going to be using most often in this demo is this diagnostic command called Istio cuddle proxy status. And it was designed really to diagnose the communication between the control plane, between Istio-D and your sidecars and your proxies in general, which our ingress gateway is also an Envoy proxy. And so you see all these columns that say, whether, all of the configuration between the control plane and the Envoy are in sync or not. But what I'm really interested in is that last column called version, which shows 112.5 right here. So I'm basically, the conclusion I come to by looking at this, the output of this command, is that ingress gateway is managed, right, is controlled by version 112.5 of Istio. All right, and that's important to point out. All right, so how do we actually turn on, if we want to deploy our workloads, we're ready to deploy book info. How do we do that? I'm sure you've done this before. If you haven't, we'll be doing it in just a minute. It's basically deploying a bunch of Kubernetes manifests, but we first need to make sure and configure a sidecar injection. And the way we typically do it is by labeling the namespace, the target namespace, which I'm going to be using the default namespace here, with a label called, Istio injection equals enabled. That's what we've sort of been taught to use. So we're breaking that habit now. And instead of doing that, we're now using a different label, which is istio.io/rev. And the value is going to be 112.5. So notice how that revision name is very important. Now, why is it called 1-12-5, not 1.12.5? And if you look at the documentation, they tell you that the values for these fields cannot contain periods in their name. So it has to do with what's a valid character in a value. And so the convention is to replace these periods with hyphens, so 1-12-5. So by labeling that default namespace, what we're essentially telling Istio is, hey, watch that namespace where there's a mutating webhook admission controller that's going to be notified every time I deploy something, and ensure that Istio proxy, which is Envoy, gets sort of bundled alongside each of these workloads. So we're about to do this. We're going to deploy book info. We're going to do a kubectl apply -f. Here we go. And we're going to deploy book info, and the typical thing that we watch for. So these are deployments and cluster IP services and service accounts. When we look at our pods, we notice that we have 2 containers in each pod, which is what we want to see. That means that we know that that sidecar injector is indeed working, and which raises another interesting question, which is which sidecar. Well, right now we have only one version of Istio, so there's no ambiguity. We know it's version 112.5. But how do we know for sure, right? And we'll do that in just a minute. So we've deployed book info. Notice that these pods are not yet ready. Maybe by now they are. Yes, they are. Perfect. So how do we check? How do we know that this is actually functioning? And the typical diagnostic command there is to run a container inside the cluster that calls the product page. So the product page is sort of the entry point to this book info application, and we're looking at the HTML output, specifically the HTML head section, which contains a title. So if we get a title back, we have a pretty good confidence that that this application is up and running and working. I guess think of it as a poor man's health check. All right, good. So book info is deployed. Now, wouldn't it be nice to also why not, we've got an ingress gateway, let's put it to use. So we're going to also deploy a gateway custom resource and a virtual service custom resource, which, as many of you may already know, those essentially arrange for ingress, which basically means that if I look at my services in Istio system, we see our ingress gateway pod. If we just grab that external IP address and sort of pop it up in a browser and reach the product page endpoint, we should see our application has been deployed. Yeah. How did I know that the endpoint was product page? That's a fair question. You can actually look at the virtual service. That's not a bad thing to poke at. So let's do a kget virtual service book info in YAML. So this is the spec for the virtual service that we applied, which sort of configured ingress. And you can see here how this actually works. It basically says, hey, I want to, anything that comes in through that gateway, if it matches these endpoints, /product page, or trying to get some static resources associated with the product page, or log in, log out, or maybe an API call, let it in on and forward it to the product page service running on port 9080. And if we look at our services, we could see that product page service on port 9080. So that basically is what it does. Great. So book info is deployed. Everything's happy, right? So this is really where things get interesting, because now we can finally begin to contemplate this idea of doing an upgrade. All right. So before we do just that, let's take another look at the istio-ctl proxy status command. All right, so let's run this command again. And now notice that we have many more proxies in our mesh. We have 7 in all. There's the ingress gateway plus 6 services, and they're all sort of managed by Istio version 112.5. So this is a great command to really quickly tell which Istio version is managing my Envoy proxies. And there are other ways to tell. So here's another command that I'd like to explore with you guys, which is basically, what am I doing here? I'm basically saying, let's go back and look at that command one more time. We're invoking the Envoy dashboard for the proxy that's attached to the detail service, right? Or the detail deployment, same thing, detail pod. And this is, for those of you who are familiar with Envoy or familiar with this page, this is the sort of admin page for Envoy. And if you really care to look at a ton of details, there's a server info endpoint, which I can make a little bit bigger. And if you search for 112.5, you can actually see that there are a number of places where it features. And so it's interesting to think through this. When I first started working through this demo, little did I know how much more I would discover along the way. So this is actually really an interesting digression, which I'd like to spend just a minute talking about. Right, all traffic inside your mesh is by default running mutual TLS. That means all workloads can authenticate other workloads and know who's talking to them. And that basically means that we're using X509 certificates, which means that we're also doing subject alternative name verification and validation. And so when we change the name of our Istio-D service from Istio-D to Istio-D-112.5, we also had to make sure to add that subject alternative name in there so that that validation would actually work. But you can also see here further down the discovery address. That basically means the Envoy is talking to Istio 112.5. That matches. And then finally, there's something called annotations here, which basically means this Envoy is actually sort of advertising itself as revision 112.5. So some of the metadata on that proxy also is an indication that we're running version 112.5. So there's many ways to know that we're running that particular version. And I'll show you one more. We can simply do something like kdescribe pod. We can look at any of our proxies. Maybe we'll pick on the rating service. Yeah, and we can do a grep on the keyword image. And you can actually see that the Docker image we're downloading has the version 112.5. So that's another way to tell. All right, everybody with me so far? I'm going to take a quick pause. I feel like I'm maybe rushing through this. Are you guys following along? Any questions? Okay, so let's carry on. All right, so let's start thinking about what's the next thing we're going to do. We've got Istio running, we've got a workload running, we know we verified that it's working, everything's good, life is good, but now we have a new version we need to upgrade. And there are many things that we need to do, and not everything that you're going to need to consider as you think about how you're going to sort of adopt upgrading Istio in your particular environment. We're not going to talk about everything, but you need to develop a process. You need to maybe have a lower level environments in which you test this in advance. And there's a video from the Istio community channel that I'm going to share with you later at the end of the demonstration, where we have an engineer from Salesforce talk about their process for upgrading Istio. So the first thing I'm going to do is switch over to 113.2. Okay, so that's why am I doing that? So that when I run Istio Cuddle, I'm now going to be running version 113.2. And it's not a bad idea to run Istio Cuddle version at this point. So what is it telling us? It's saying, hey, you're using version 113 of the CLI, but your control plane and your data plane, 7 proxies to be exact, are actually tied to version 112.5 at the moment. So Istio Cuddle version has a great utility in this scenario, which I didn't envisage when I started out. So we begin just like we did the last time, right? We'll do a pre-check, but now we're doing a pre-check with an eye towards version 113. And we are told there are no issues found, so go ahead and it's safe to proceed with your installation or your upgrade, whichever it may be. So that's good. So far, so good. And now we're ready to sort of proceed with the installation. So the idea here is to install 113 alongside 112. Now, when we run this command, the output here is rather interesting. The CLI was smart enough to know that we're upgrading. It knows we have 112. It knows we want to install 113. Ergo, we're upgrading. And it gives us advice. It says, before upgrading, you might want to, we have another command that you might want to check out called Istio Cuddle Analyze to check that, if there are deprecation warnings, if you're using specific Istio CRDs that might have, whose specifications might have changed, we'll point that out for you. So that sounds great. And it also makes a reference to something called IST. It's these codes, IST02, IST135. What's that about? So I'm going to pause. I'm not going to install just yet. And let's just take a look at that real quick together. So we're going to run analyze. But know that there is a page in the Istio documentation called Configuration Analysis Messages, which actually is a catalog of all the different messages that Istio might actually come back with in terms of error messages or warnings and what each of them means. So just I want you to know that you can actually look those up. There is a reference. So what is this analyze command? Let's see if I can pull that up. Yeah, so there's a page actually that's dedicated to explaining Istio Cuddle Analyze. So I highly recommend when you have some time, read all about that extra command. We're going to run it, and you can run it against all namespaces if you want with the -a command, and it should give us an all clear. And I was rather surprised to find out that it doesn't. What's it telling us here? It says, by the way, you have an object there, a gateway, right, called book info gateway. And yes, that's true, I do. What about it? It basically references a selector that I could not find. So what is that about? Let's look at that. Let's get gateway, book info gateway, and in YAML, so we can look at the spec. Sure enough, we see under the spec, there is a selector called Istio : ingress gateway. And sure enough, if you were to search for gateways in this current namespace with that label, you will come up empty-handed. But that's actually a cross namespace reference. So let me digress for a second and explain how this works. When you define a gateway, here we go. Let's look at the gateway command reference, not this guy. There we go. Notice there is a selector, but if you read the description of that selector, it's by default configured to look for gateways across all namespaces. So we're good. So this turns out to be a false positive, but it's not a bad thing to double check before we go ahead and proceed with installation. And indeed, I actually was able to find a GitHub issue on Istio, which talks about false positive for things that are referenced cross namespaces. So having done my sort of homework here, I'm sort of fairly confident that I can ignore that warning from Istio Analyze and sort of proceed. So let's go ahead and finally install Istio 1.13. Now, what's interesting, and I'm going to go ahead and say yes, I think everything looks good, right? I'm using the right version of Istio Cuddle. I'm using a revision label called 1-13-2, and I'm going to sort of do a bombs away. And so when you read the sort of the instructions on the Istio documentation about this particular operation, you're actually told that your ingress gateway pod is actually upgraded in place. So, and we should be able to verify that in just a minute. So that basically means that deployment, there's a deployment from our ingress gateway, has been replaced, and we can find out. So how do we find out? We can do a kget maybe deploy -n istio system, and notice that well, we don't see yet what version our ingress gateway is, but notice that we've got istiod, 2 versions of istiod installed, and we could do an istio cuddle proxy status, and here we'll see that the ingress gateway is actually now been upgraded to version 1.13. And if we had caught it, if we had looked or watched the Istio system namespace while we were doing the upgrade, we would have seen one pod being terminated and version 1.13 of that being replaced. Now, why is that, right? The ingress gateway is running a copy of Envoy, right? And with every new release of Istio, we get perhaps an upgraded version of Envoy with fixes and improvements and so on. So our gateway has already been upgraded, but our workloads are still tied to version 1.12, which is kind of nice. We can divorce the installation of our control plane. This is always step one. When you want to deal with upgrades with zero downtime, the first thing you need to be able to do is deploy the new version without affecting anything that's running, right? And that goes for your workloads as well. And so that's what we're seeing here, is we have Istio 1.12 is still running and it's still managing all of our proxies. And it's important to also mention Istio Cuddle version is surprisingly informative here. It says, hey, by the way, you have kind of a mixed bag right now. You're running a cluster with 2 versions of istiod and with 6 proxies tethered to 1.12 and 1 tethered to 1.13, which is kind of cool. Is my application still working at this juncture? That's not a bad question to ask. And sure enough, we can do sort of a poor man test. Can we still reach our workloads, book info? And sure enough, that seems to continue to work. Oh, so far so good. So really, our work is shrinking when you think about it. We've already done half of the upgrade. We've upgraded Istio, but we haven't upgraded our sidecars, and that's what we're going to do next. And so the question is, well, how do you do that? And here you can see in the instructions, it's just a matter of relabeling things. So remember that sidecar injector? We do kget ns. If we look at our namespaces with labels, we know that our default namespace is labeled 112. So if we just relabel it with the command that I'm showing here, label namespace default 113.2, that basically means that when I restart my deployments, any new pods that get created will be sort of the responsibility of the new injector, right? If we look at our mutating webhook configurations, we have a 113 injector, and it'll be the one starting new pods with the right version of Envoy. And this step actually gave me pause. It gave me pause, and let me explain why. One of the big features that we tout with service meshes is this ability to do upgrades canary style, to completely divorce two separate concerns. One is the ability to scale your workloads from traffic management, from deciding how much traffic you want to send to one version and another. And so, why are we sort of falling back to a kubectl rollout restart, which is perfectly fine, right? If your workloads run, two replicas, right? Then when you do a rollout restart, the rollout restart will take care to take down one of the replicas, bring up a new one, and so you never have any downtime, and that works. That's like a blue-green deployment sort of baked in. But can we do better? And this is, I'm going to deviate from my instructions here and talk about doing it kind of blue-green style. That is, if I've got pods running in my default namespace, that's book info. Why not create a namespace? Maybe I'll call it green. After blue-green, and maybe label that. So instead of relabeling default to 113.2, I'm going to sort of doctor up this command. I'm going to label green with 113.2, and there's nothing to override here, so we do that. Right, so the idea is if I deploy another copy of book info, well, obviously you have to have the resources to have two copies, but that's relatively cheap. I'd rather err on the side of safety. If I want to deploy book info to the green namespace, now I can actually always, if something goes wrong, I can revert back to version 112. I'm not actually replacing 112. I'm sort of switching, right? That's the difference. And that's another point in time where I want to reflect, because what are we doing here? We're not really changing our code, right? And yet something is changing. And if you're an experienced developer, you know where I'm going here is every time you make any sort of change, there is the potential, right? The risk that something could break. And so it may not be a bad idea to do this canary style. So hopefully I've convinced you. And so we're going to do a k-apply-f. What is it? Samples, book info, platform, bookinfo.yaml. But to the green namespace. So I'm deploying a second instance there. All right, so we've got two namespaces, and if I look at pods in the green namespace, we could see that our second book info is coming up, and we should be able to verify, right? Let's do it. It's your proxy status at this point. Verify that our new proxies are indeed tethered to Istio 113, but all the traffic's going to 112. So how do we switch traffic from 112 to 113? Well, we can edit our virtual service. We have a virtual service called bookinfo. And we can actually maybe duplicate this, and we can have two destinations. We could say there's a product page.default.service.cluster.local and a product page.green.service.cluster.local. And then we can tack on some weights here. Say, I always forget. I think we did it at this level. We can say we'll put 90% of traffic. We'll leave it at 112 because we're still canary testing 113, and maybe we'll put 10% of traffic with 113. So that's, in my opinion, a better way to proceed with our upgrade, to be safe, to be cautious, to sort of siphon off just a little bit of traffic to 113. And we can really test this if we want to. We could do something like maybe a split screen like this, k log follow -n green what is it? Maybe the product page. Yeah, product K-logs. Is it K-log or K-logs? There we go. Okay. So we're looking at the logs for the product page in the green namespace, and we're going to do the same thing here. Default product page. And now we'll sort of do a poor man's test, which is to maybe bring up our little book info application. Let's see. If I refresh this page, 90% of traffic should go to the bottom panel, so you can see the log messages coming on the bottom there. But once in a while, the top one's going to be called. So we know that our sort of traffic split is actually working, and that's all I really wanted to verify here. So we're good. Everything's good. I like that a whole lot better. So the question is, where do we proceed from here? Well, it's just a matter of here we go. It's a matter of changing our virtual service one more time. K-edit virtual service, book info. And now that we know that we're confident, maybe we monitored traffic for some time, and we know that we're ready to sort of move on to the new version, so to speak, of our book info service, we can just modify the virtual service like so. And now all traffic is going to be directed to the new version. So again, so now we're just left with a cleanup operation, so to speak. Right? Okay, so let's sort of catch up with our sort of little to-do list here. Yeah, we're ready to tear down our old version and our old workloads. So if I look at pods in the default namespace, I can k-delete-f. Samples, book info, platform q, book info.yaml. And it feels a little bit scary. Did I get the wrong one? And that's why you want to automate a lot of this operationalization. But if I sort of do my simple test here, you know that I'm now running all on 113, right? So this is great. I feel like I have all the tools I need to know what's going on, to do things carefully. This is really terrific. And notice that the version column is now saying 113 across the board, right, from top to bottom, which basically means that now I'm ready to delete 112, which is great. So how do we delete 112? There's a new command that will actually take away version 112 without disturbing 113, again, by using that revision tag. We use Istio cuddle, uninstall, -- revision 112.5. And that will get rid of 112.5, but rest assured everything's still working and everything's up and we've had no downtime. Isn't that exciting? Isn't that wonderful? So now we've got only version 113 running, and we're sort of done, right? Right on cue, as it were. But I haven't yet talked about revision tags. So what's revision tags about? So hopefully you'll stick with me for a few more minutes, because I think this is interesting. It's basically this idea of creating yet one more level of indirection for giving us a little bit more flexibility. So the idea here is, if we look at our namespace labels, get namespace -l, we know that our green namespace is labeled 113, which is great. And that the idea is to just modify that label if you want to upgrade to 114 or downgrade back to 112. And so the level of indirection I'm referring to is this idea that maybe you can, instead of relabeling your namespaces, introduce a separate concept that's completely orthogonal to the namespace labels, called a tag. So the Istio cuddle command has the notion of a tag and the name that you're going to use for that tag. And it's going to be sort of the label that you're going to use on that namespace as well. It's going to be more semantic. So, if it's a production workload, maybe we call it prod, or maybe if it's not, we call it QA or dev or what have you. And the meaning of prod, or the association of prod to a particular version of Istio, is going to vary over time. So today it's 113, tomorrow it might be 114. So the idea is the tag will change, the revision associated with the tag will change, but the tag will stay the same. The label will stay the same. And if you do that, then you won't really need to modify labels in your namespace. That's kind of not full. So what am I doing here? I'm creating a tag called prod associated with version 113. And we're told again here that there's a warning or an error that the injector is referring to a service that doesn't exist. And as far as I could tell, this error message is in error if you actually look in the Istio system namespace, the service is indeed named Istio D113.2. So I don't know what they're talking about. I'm just going to ignore it. So now, along with this tag command, tag set command rather, is another command called a companion command called Istio cuddle tag list. So you can actually see that you have a tag called prod that's pointing to revision 113.2, but it's not tied to any namespaces. So if I now label, okay, label ns green Istio io/rev equals 113.2, no, is equal to prod, and we'll need to do an override on that. Okay. So now if I rerun Istio cuddle tag list, you could actually see the namespaces that are tied to prod. So if you have multiple namespaces that are production workloads, you can label them all with prod, and so now you're sort of dissociating what prod means in terms of revision. So you could just modify the tag by doing an Istio cuddle, tag set like that, like so. So just like I was showing earlier, let's see. Yeah, Istio cuddle tag set prod to revision 112.5. So we could do that if we wanted to. And it's interesting that if we try that, Istio cuddle tag set, and we change it now to 112.5, say we want to downgrade, it's actually smart enough to know. So it's nice to see all the validation that's built in, to know that 112.5 is no longer installed. So it's not going to let us. It says, hey, maybe you don't want to do that. So we'd need to go back to our 112.5 folder, right, and do an Istio cuddle install and set the revision to 112.5 to sort of bring it back, to resurrect it. Maybe I deleted it too soon, and then I'll say yes. And then once I do that, I'll be able to modify my label. Okay, that's how that works. And then, sure enough, if I do that, I'll basically be downgrading, okay, to 112.5. So let's just maybe do that as our sort of final step and complete our demonstration. Okay, so 112.5 is being installed, and I just need to repeat that command here that failed earlier, that Istio cuddle tag set command that you see up here. All right, so this is done, Istio cuddle tag set. We're going to try to set it to 112.5 now, and we need to do an override, right? And now it'll let us. And if I now do an Istio cuddle tag list, you'll see that my prod is now 112.5. Maybe something went wrong with 113. I want to revert. And again, Istio cuddle proxy status is your friend. And notice that now our ingress gateway has already been in place, downgraded, but not my workloads. And then I would do my blue-green deployment again. Or maybe if I were to really lazy and really confident that nothing's going to go wrong, maybe I could just do that kubectl rollout restart deployment. The namespace now should be the green namespace. And as I restart it, the new pods will come up, and now we'll be sort of tethered to version 112. And again, we could do an Istio cuddle. I do a watch Istio cuddle version, which is a great way to see things change. So notice there's some proxies that are still running 113, but notice that number is going down. It'll go down to 0 in just a minute as these pods are terminating and the new ones are coming up with the right version of the sidecar. So that's kind of cool to see that. And now I can maybe uninstall version 113. So that's the idea. Now there's a couple of really interesting thoughts that sort of came out of doing this exercise that I want to really sort of take a moment to discuss. Well, number one, what about the gateways? Don't I, upgrading them in place, is there a better way? Can I canary upgrade those gateways as well? And it turns out you can. Indeed, that's completely documented, but you have to know where to look. There is a whole page dedicated to installing and upgrading gateways. And sure enough, you can upgrade gateways either in place or doing a canary upgrade. So how does that work? The basic recipe is to completely divorce those two coupled concerns, right? When you use the default profile, you're installing both the gateway and IstioD, but you don't have to. You can use the minimal profile to install just IstioD and separately install the gateway using the empty profile with a manifest file that installs just the gateway component. And when you do that, then you can completely upgrade the two independently of one another. And the mechanism is pretty much, it's very similar. It's using the same revision tag that we've been talking about, that istio.io/rev. But now you set that on the deployment for your ingress gateway. And that's what governs which version of Envoy you end up deploying. So my closing thoughts are as follows. I think this feature, from a design point of view, I give it a thumbs up. I really like it. I like the way it's designed, and I like what it gives you in terms of flexibility. Imagine a team of operators that is in charge of upgrading Istio. They can upgrade Istio without disturbing any of their workloads. And they can actually send out a message to developers saying, hey, there's a new version of Istio out there. And at your own pace, development teams, feel free to upgrade your workloads. And you can leave the old version sort of running there for even an extended period of time as your workloads sort of migrate at your development team's sort of pace to the new version, which is terrific. And then the other thing that I've maybe mentioned in passing earlier is that if you're really going to operationalize this, you're not going to do this by hand because humans are error prone. You want to think about automation. How do you actually implement these steps in a way that is error proof and that also affords you the ability to do rollback and give you the maximum amount of flexibility. And now that I've said that, I also want to share this. There's a link here that you really ought to follow. It's a talk by Pratima Nambiar from Salesforce. It's a terrific talk on the Istio YouTube channel on the playlist called Istio Community, where she talks about, around minute 21 or 22, she talks about the process that Salesforce has adopted for doing these upgrades. And you definitely, that's probably not a bad place to start if you're really going to sort of take this recipe to the next step. All right, so that's the conclusion of our demo. I hope you find this interesting and useful. And as we go through these topics over time, we'll all become service mesh experts, which is terrific, in my opinion. So let me just conclude our episode with just reiterating, we want to hear from you. If you have ideas for topics, don't be shy, send them on the Tetrate community Slack channel. And just want to say thank you for your time and for your feedback in advance. And we'll see you in next week's episode. All right, thank you and goodbye.